The diner buzzed with the usual lunchtime rush, waitresses weaving through tables, orders being called out, the clatter of plates meeting countertops. Among them, a young waitress, clearly pregnant, moved carefully between tables, balancing a tray with practiced ease. She greeted every customer with a warm smile despite the strain that was evident in her posture. Some noticed and offered kind words, while others were too caught up in their meals to pay her any mind. And then there were customers like him. He walked in with an air of entitlement, his polished shoes tapping against the floor as he made his way to a booth by the window. With an impatient sigh, he slid into the seat, glancing around as though unimpressed with everything he saw. His suit was crisp, his watch expensive, and his demeanor screamed self-importance. The moment the waitress approached, his eyes flickered to her rounded belly, and something in his expression shifted: disapproval, irritation, maybe even disgust. Finally, he muttered before she could even greet him. "I've been sitting here forever." The waitress, accustomed to impatient customers, offered a polite apology and pulled out her notepad. "What can I get started for you today?" He barely glanced at the menu. "Black coffee. Extra hot. And don't mess it up." She jotted it down, keeping her composure. She had dealt with worse. But something about the way he looked at her as if her mere existence was an inconvenience made her stomach tighten. Still, she turned in a hurry to place his order. When she returned with the coffee, the man took one sip and scowled. "Are you serious? This is lukewarm at best. Do you even know how to do your job?" A few customers turned their heads, sensing the hostility in his voice. The waitress swallowed her frustration and calmly offered to bring him a fresh cup. But he wasn't done. "Honestly, I don't even know why places hire people like you," he said, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I mean, look at you. You can barely keep up as it is, and you're waddling around like you're about to pop. Maybe you should stay home instead of making everyone else suffer through this." The words hit harder than she expected. A silence settled over the diner, tension thick in the air. The waitress tightened her grip on the coffee pot, willing herself to stay composed. She had heard rude comments before, endured impatient customers, and let their words roll off her back. But this? This was different. This wasn't just about her job, this was personal. What the man didn't know, what none of the customers knew, was the truth behind why she was here, why she had to keep working despite everything. And in just a few moments, he was about to find out in the most unexpected way. The silence in the diner stretched longer than it should have. A few people shifted in their seats, some pretending not to have heard the man's cruel words, while others exchanged glances of discomfort. The waitress, standing still with the coffee pot in hand, felt the heat rising not just from the scalding liquid inside but from the lump forming in her throat. She had worked here long enough to know that standing up for herself could cost her more than just a tip. Still, something in her refused to let this moment pass unnoticed. She met the man's cold gaze, her fingers tightening around the handle. "I'll bring you another coffee," she said evenly, forcing her voice to remain steady. He let out a scoff, shaking his head as if she were the most incompetent person he had ever encountered. "Yeah, you do that. And try not to mess it up this time." As she turned away, she caught the hushed murmurs of a couple sitting nearby. An older woman leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Did you hear what he said to that poor girl?" Her husband, a quiet man with kind eyes, merely nodded, his jaw tightening. In the kitchen, she took a deep breath before pouring a fresh cup. The heat from the steam felt grounding, like something solid she could hold on to. It wasn't the first time she'd been spoken to like this. Some people saw a pregnant woman working and immediately assumed she had made a mess of her life. They never stopped to wonder why. They never asked. She had learned to endure it. But today, something felt different. She set the coffee on the counter and grabbed a clean plate, preparing the man's meal without another word. The kitchen door swung open, and one of the other waitresses, a petite, fiery woman with sharp eyes, leaned in. "I swear, if I had taken his order, I would have dumped that coffee right in his lap," she muttered. The waitress shook her head, managing a weak smile. "It's fine. Not worth it." Her coworker gave her a look. "It's not fine. He's a jerk. And he's looking at you like." She cut herself off with a sigh. "Never mind. Just be careful, okay?" Carrying the tray back out, she placed the fresh cup in front of the man, who barely acknowledged her. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started scrolling, already done with her. She walked away, pretending the exchange never happened, but the weight of his words lingered. The other customers still seemed uneasy. The older couple had stopped whispering and were now watching her closely, as if debating whether to say something. A group of college students in the corner had fallen unusually quiet. Even the cook behind the counter had a look on his face that said he'd been listening. And then, just when she thought the moment had passed, a soft voice spoke from the far side of the diner. "You okay, miss?" She turned. A boy no older than 10 was looking up at her with wide, earnest eyes. His mother, sitting across from him, stiffened slightly, her gaze flickering between her son and the rude customer. The waitress smiled, touched by the boy's concern. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said gently. The man at the booth let out a low chuckle. "Oh, come on. Now you've got kids feeling sorry for you?" He shook his head, his voice laced with condescension. "Pathetic." Something inside her snapped. Before she could stop herself, she turned back to him. "You know," she said, keeping her tone even, "I don't mind rude customers. I don't mind impatience, bad tempers, even insults. But what I do mind is people who go out of their way to make others feel small." The diner went completely silent. Even the man finally looked up from his phone, mildly surprised that she had spoken back. For a brief second, something unreadable passed through his expression, something close to recognition. But before anything else could be said, the front door of the diner swung open, and a gust of cold air swept through. A man in a dark coat stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The moment he saw the rude customer, his expression darkened. Without hesitation, he made his way straight toward the booth. The waitress had no idea what was about to happen. But something told her that this day was far from over. The man in the dark coat moved with quiet determination, his eyes locked onto the rude customer like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The waitress felt the air shift, a crackling tension settling over the diner as the stranger's presence turned heads. Conversations hushed. Forks clinked against plates before being set down. Even the college students in the corner, who had been murmuring among themselves, fell completely silent. The rude customer, still seated in his booth, finally seemed to register that something was off. He glanced up, his brows pulling together in irritation. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice sharp, impatient. The man didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat, and for a split second, the waitress felt her stomach drop. Was this about to turn into something dangerous? Her mind raced through every worst-case scenario, but before panic could take hold, the man pulled out not a weapon, but a folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto the table. "You left before I could give you this," the man said, his voice steady, unreadable. The rude customer hesitated before picking up the paper. As his eyes scanned the words, his expression shifted in ways the waitress had never seen before. First, annoyance. Then confusion. And finally, something else. His face paled, his jaw tightening. He gripped the paper so hard his knuckles turned white. "This is a joke," he muttered under his breath. "You think this means anything?" The man in the coat tilted his head slightly, studying him. "It means everything, and you know it." The waitress exchanged glances with her coworker behind the counter, both of them trying to make sense of what was unfolding. The rude customer, so arrogant, so untouchable just moments ago, suddenly looked like a man whose world had just shifted beneath him. His fingers trembled slightly as he set the paper down. "You don't get to do this here," he hissed, keeping his voice low, as if suddenly aware of the growing number of eyes on him. The man in the coat let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think you get to control where this happens? After everything?" His gaze flickered toward the waitress for the briefest moment, but before she could process why, he turned back to the rude customer. "No more running. You owe people the truth." The words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The waitress felt an odd sensation creeping up her spine, as though she were on the edge of discovering something huge, something that had been hidden in plain sight. She stole a glance at the paper still resting on the table, but she was too far away to make out what it said. The rude customer swallowed hard, his demeanor no longer smug but defensive. "This isn't the place," he muttered again, lower this time. The man in the coat took a step closer, lowering his voice but making sure everyone still heard. "No, this is exactly the place." The waitress watched as something shifted in the rude customer's posture. A deep exhale. A decision made. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned in his seat and, for the first time since he had walked into the diner, really looked at her. And then, in a voice that no longer carried its earlier condescension, he said something that made the entire diner hold its breath. "It's about your baby." The words hit like a shockwave, freezing the waitress in place. A dozen thoughts flooded her mind all at once, none of them making sense. What did he mean? How could this man, a complete stranger, have anything to do with her child? She felt the room tilt slightly, the edges of her vision blurring, but she forced herself to stay standing. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. "You don't know anything about my baby," she said, her voice firm but laced with confusion. The rude customer, who now looked more like a man unraveling at the seams, ran a hand through his hair, his composure cracking. "I didn't think I did," he admitted. "But I was wrong." The waitress's breath caught. She didn't know what was more unsettling, the fact that this stranger was suddenly speaking about her unborn child with such weight, or the fact that, deep down, she could feel something shifting. Something that told her this moment was about to change everything. And she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning the waitress couldn't yet grasp. The rude customer, now stripped of his arrogance, looked at her with something raw, something almost pleading. Around them, the diner remained unervingly quiet. Every set of eyes flickered between the two of them, caught in a moment that had suddenly become too big for the walls around them. She forced herself to steady her breathing. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "How could my baby have anything to do with you?" The man exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if trying to find the right words. His confidence, his smugness, all of it was gone. Now, there was only hesitation, regret. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I swear, I didn't know until now." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Know what?" The man in the coat, the one who had walked in moments ago and changed everything, crossed his arms, watching carefully. "Tell her," he said. The rude customer, "No." The stranger looked down at the folded paper still on the table. After a moment, he pushed it toward her. "Read it." She hesitated for a long second before setting down the coffee pot and picking up the paper with careful hands. Unfolding it, her eyes swept over the words. Her breath caught. The paper wasn't just a document, it was a DNA test. And right there, in bold letters, were two names, hers and his. A confirmation. A biological link. Her hands trembled as she looked back up, her mind spinning. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." The man swallowed hard. "It is." A strange ringing filled her ears as memories started to resurface. Her mother, who had always been evasive about certain things. The way she never spoke about him, the father she had claimed wasn't worth mentioning. She had accepted that. She had moved on. And yet, here he was. "You're lying," she said, her voice cracking. The man looked at her with something close to sorrow. "I wish I was." The weight of it hit her like a crashing wave. This wasn't just some entitled customer anymore. This was her father. The man who had never been there. The man she had spent her whole life not knowing. And now, here he was, sitting in her section, insulting her, making her feel small, completely unaware of who she was. A painful silence followed, but then the man in the coat spoke again, breaking the moment. "He didn't know about you," he said, looking at the waitress. "And you didn't know about him. But the truth was always there. And now it's time to face it." Her father let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't even know she existed," he admitted. "Not until a week ago when I got that test in the mail. And even then, I didn't believe it. I thought it had to be some kind of mistake." He let out a breath, shaking his head. "But then I saw you today, and something felt different. I just didn't put it together until now." The waitress felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. All this time, she had worked so hard, carried so much alone, believing she had no real family. And now, this. She clenched the paper in her hands, her emotions warring inside her. "You came in here and treated me like I was nothing," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't even see me. And now, I'm just supposed to believe you care?" His face twisted, and for the first time, she saw guilt. Real guilt. I don't have an excuse," he admitted. "I've been an arrogant, selfish man my whole life. And today was no different." He swallowed, looking at her, really looking at her. "But I do care. Because whether I deserve to be or not, I'm your father." The words hit her harder than she expected. A part of her wanted to scream, to tell him it was too late, that he didn't get to walk in and suddenly be something to her. But another part, one she had buried deep, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was something she had needed to hear her whole life. The diner remained eerily quiet, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. And then, just as she was about to respond, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. She gasped, gripping the counter. Her coworker rushed forward. "Are you okay?" She nodded quickly, though her breath came fast. "Yeah, just another pain. Stronger this time." Her father stood abruptly, his face paling. "What's wrong?" She let out a shaky breath, her hands cradling her belly. "I think." She winced as another wave of pain hit. "I think the baby's coming." Chaos erupted. Someone shouted for help. Her coworker fumbled for their phone to call an ambulance. The older couple near the window stood, offering support. And in the middle of it all, her father, the man she had just learned existed, was frozen in place, watching helplessly as his daughter, the one he had just found, went into labor right in front of him. And for the first time in his life, he realized this was a moment he couldn't run from.